You are standing on the walls of your city. The ground beneath your feet begins to tremble, not from an earthquake, but from the thundering hooves of 10,000 horses. The horizon turns black with dust. The Mongols have arrived. You know the stories. You know that resistance is futile. But for the women inside the city walls, specifically the wives of the rulers and generals, a fate far more complex and terrifying than death awaits. He didn't just want to conquer your land. He wanted to rewrite your bloodline. Today, we are diving deep into the dark, calculated, and bone-chilling strategy of the Great Khan. This isn't just a story about war. It is a story about the ultimate domination of the human soul. This is what Genghis Khan really did to his enemies' wives. To truly grasp the fate of these women, you have to look past the swords and arrows. You must first venture into the dark, labyrinthine mind of the man himself. History often makes a mistake of painting Genghis Khan as a mindless brute, a force of nature like a hurricane or a wild animal that simply destroys everything in its path. But that is a dangerous underestimation. Genghis Khan was not a savage. He was a cold, calculating, and frighteningly efficient genius. He was an architect of a new world order, and he understood a fundamental truth about humanity that modern conquerors often forget. True immortality doesn't come from building statues of stone that will eventually crumble into sand. True immortality comes from DNA. For the Mongols, war wasn't a political dispute. It wasn't just about drawing lines on a map or seizing gold. It was about the absolute, crushing humiliation of the opponent. It was about total erasure. When Genghis Khan defeated a rival tribe or a great empire like the Khwarezmians, killing the men was the easy part. That was simply administrative cleanup. It was removing the current threat. But Genghis was playing a longer game. He knew that as long as the enemy's bloodline existed, as long as their culture remained intact within home, resistance could one day return. The real victory, the psychological checkmate, lay in what he did with the women they left behind. There's a famous quote, often debated by historians but widely attributed to the Great Khan, that serves as the terrifying mission statement for his life. It perfectly summarizes his philosophy of total domination. He reportedly said, "The greatest happiness is to vanquish your enemies, to chase them before you, to rob them of their wealth, to see those dear to them bathed in tears, and to clasp to your bosom their wives and daughters." Let that sink in for a moment. Really analyze those words. He doesn't mention peace. He doesn't mention prosperity. His definition of happiness, his ultimate dopamine rush, was intimately tied to possession of his enemies' wives. Why? Because in the harsh, brutal code of the steppe, taking a man's wife was a final signal to the world that the old king was dead. It was a message broadcast in flesh and blood. It said, "I have not just beaten you. I have replaced you. Your children will not be born. My children will be born in their place." It was the ultimate assertion of dominance. He wasn't just conquering their land. He was colonizing their future. Now, imagine the human reality of this philosophy. Picture a woman of noble birth, a queen or general's wife living in a great city like Samarkand or Beijing. For her entire life, she has been the center of her world. She is draped in silk, dripping in jewels, accustomed to servants bowing when she enters a room. She carries the dignity of her ancestors and the pride of her nation. She is the mother of princes. Then the walls fall. The drums of the Mongol horde drown out the prayers in the temples. When the city is breached, her reality fractures. In the span of a single hour, the fall of her city means the instant, violent stripping of her identity. As she is dragged from the palace, she is not treated as a person, but as a biological asset. The moment Genghis Khan or his generals laid claim to her, she ceased to be a queen. The respect, the lineage, the history, it was all incinerated. She became a trophy. This was the era of the wolf. For these women, the terror was specific. It wasn't just a fear of death. It was a horror of assimilation. Genghis Khan would often take these highborn women and force them to serve him or his commanders. He would impregnate them, ensuring that the next generation of royalty in that region would carry his genetic marker, not the defeated kings. It was a form of psychological torture designed to break the spirit of the conquered nation forever. The survivors had to watch as their queens became the concubines of the invaders. They had to watch as the sacred bloodlines of their leaders were diluted and washed away by the Mongol tide. Genghis Khan didn't just want to win the war. He wanted to ensure that the enemy never had the will to fight again. And he achieved this by turning the wives of his enemies into the mothers of his empire. So, the city falls. The screaming stops. The smoke begins to clear, revealing a skyline of broken towers and burning timber. Usually, in the history of ancient warfare, this is a moment where chaos reigns, mindless looting, uncontrolled burning, a frenzy of violence. But the Mongols were different. What happened next was a systematic process that was terrifying specifically because of its efficiency. The Mongols didn't just rampage, they sorted. They audited the conquered city like accountants tallying a ledger. Only the assets were human lives. After the dust settled, the surviving women were rounded up. This wasn't a chaotic mob running for their lives. It was a forced assembly. Soldiers would herd the women into the main squares or open fields outside the city walls. It was a lineup, a chilling beauty pageant held at the edge of a sword. The tension in these moments would have been suffocating. Thousands of eyes were fixed on the arrival of the command tent. Genghis Khan, or his highest-ranking sons, always had the first pick. This wasn't just about lust. It was about power dynamics. Genghis Khan sought out the most beautiful, the most high-ranking, and the most distinctive wives of the defeated leaders. He was looking for the women who appeared on the coins, the women who sat on the thrones, the women who symbolized the nation he had just broken. This election was deeply strategic. By taking the queen of a conquered nation as his own wife, Genghis Khan was performing a ritual of legitimacy. To the common people of the conquered city, seeing their queen standing by the side of the Khan sent a powerful, undeniable message. I am your king now. It was a way of weaving himself into the local royal history. He wasn't just an invader anymore. He was a husband of the queen. He was absorbing their sovereignty into his own. But what about the others? What about the hundreds, sometimes thousands, of noble women merchant wives and daughters who Genghis didn't pick for himself? They became the peril. You have to understand that the Mongol army didn't receive a weekly salary of gold coins. They fought for the promise of spoils. And in the brutal economy of the steppe, high-ranking women were treated like high-value currency. Once the Khan made a selection, the distribution began. The wives of generals, governors, and wealthy merchants were gifted to Genghis's most loyal commanders and top-tier warriors. It was a terrifying redistribution of human lives, conducted with a casual nature of handing out bonuses. Picture the sheer psychological horror of that transition. A woman who woke up that morning as the wife of a Persian governor, draped in silk, commanding servants, and living in a palace, might go to sleep that night as the third wife of a rough Mongol horseman. She would be stripped of her jewelry, her status, and her name. She would be moved from a stone palace to a felt yurt that smelled of smoke and horse sweat. She would be forced to cook, clean, and bear children for the very man who had likely killed her husband just hours before. It was a fall from grace so steep and so sudden that it shattered the minds of many who endured it. This practice did more than just reward the troops. It destroyed the social fabric of the conquered nation permanently. By redistributing the women, Genghis Khan ensured that the enemy's bloodline ended right there on the battlefield. The family trees of the conquered kings were chopped down at the roots. The most profound impact, however, was on the next generation. The children born to these women would not be raised as Persians or Tatars or Chinese. They would not hear the stories of their mother's people or worship their mother's gods. They would be raised in the saddle. They would be raised to worship the eternal blue sky. They would be raised as Mongols. These women, the former elite of the world, became the incubators for the Mongol future. Their DNA was harvested to fuel the very war machine that had destroyed their homes. It was the ultimate colonization, not of the land, but of the womb. To truly grasp the terror of Genghis Khan's policies, you have to peel back the layers of the legend and look at the man underneath. You have to understand that for Genghis, the policy on enemy wives wasn't just business, and it wasn't just politics. It was deeply, agonizingly personal. The root of this brutality goes back to a single traumatic event that defined his entire psychology. Decades before he was a great Khan, when he was just a young outcast named Temujin trying to survive on the harsh Mongolian steppe, he fell in love. He married his first wife, Borte, a woman who was his anchor in a chaotic world. But shortly after their marriage, disaster struck. A rival tribe called the Merkits, old enemies of his father, raided his camp. In the chaos of the attack, Temujin managed to escape to the mountains, but he left Borte behind. The Merkits captured her. For a Mongol man, this was the ultimate humiliation. In a culture where the ability to protect one's family was the sole measure of a man's worth, Temujin had failed. The Merkits didn't just kill her, they did something worse. They gave her away like an object to one of their warriors, a man named Chilger. For months, Temujin had to live with the knowledge that his wife was in the tent of his enemy. He had to imagine her serving them, living with them, being forced into intimacy with the men who wanted him dead. It burned in him like a fever. Temujin eventually gathered allies and launched a daring rescue mission. He got Borte back, but the damage was done. When she returned, she was pregnant. 9 months later, she gave birth to a son named Joki. Temujin raised the boy as his own, but the question of Joki's true father, was it Temujin or the Merkit warrior, haunted him for the rest of his life. This experience changed him. It calcified his heart. He realized that in this brutal world, mercy was a weakness. Years later, when he finally united the tribes and rose to power as Genghis Khan, the Merkits were the first to feel the full weight of his unresolved trauma. He didn't just want to defeat them in battle. He wanted to erase them from the face of the earth. He unleashed a special kind of hell on the Merkit tribe. The war was absolute. When the dust settled, the Merkit army was annihilated. Their leaders executed. But for the women, the nightmare was just beginning. Genghis Khan systematically took the wives and daughters of the Merkit leaders and distributed them among his family and troops. This was his answer to the kidnapping of Borte. You took my wife? Now I will take your entire generation. The most famous example of this was a woman named Kalan, often cited as the daughter of the Merkit chief Deir Yusin. She was a woman of incredible beauty and status within her tribe. Genghis didn't just enslave her, he took her as his wife. This was a calculated move. By taking Kalan, the princess of his most hated enemies, into his own tent, he was completing the circle of revenge. Every time the surviving Merkits saw her by his side, they were reminded of their total defeat. But consider the psychological torture for the women themselves. This wasn't just physical captivity. It was the imprisonment of the soul. Imagine being a Merkit woman. Your husband has been slaughtered by Mongol arrows. Your brothers are dead. Your city is ash. And now, you are forced to share a bed with the very man who ordered the massacre. You are forced to pour his wine, mend his clothes, and bear his children. These women had to live every single day looking into the eyes of their conquerors. They couldn't mourn their husbands because their new husbands were the killers. They couldn't teach their children the songs of the Merkits because those songs were now forbidden. Genghis Khan forced the wives of his enemies to serve the architects of their destruction. It was a method designed to break the spirit of the tribe forever. By the time the next generation grew up, the Merkit identity was gone, dissolved into the Mongol bloodline. The personal vendetta against the Merkits proves that Genghis Khan's strategy wasn't just about expanding an empire. It was about exorcising his own demons, using the wives of his enemies to silence the memory of his own humiliation. We have talked about what Genghis Khan did to the wives of his enemies. But to understand the full scope of his genius, we have to look at the flip side of the coin. We have to look at how he weaponized the women of his own bloodline. While he was busy dismantling enemy families, Genghis Khan was simultaneously playing a game of 4D chess with his own daughters that terrified the kings of Asia. Historians often focus on his sons, the generals who rode horses and shot arrows. But in reality, the backbone of the Mongol administration, the glue that held the empire together, was often his daughters. This strategy was known as daughter diplomacy. But don't let the gentle name fool you. It was a death sentence wrapped in a wedding dress. Here's how the trap worked. As the Mongol war machine rolled across the steppes, Genghis would often encounter smaller nations, kingdoms like the Uyghurs or the Karluks. These were nations he needed as allies to secure his supply lines. Instead of destroying them, he offered them a deal. He would offer the king of that nation a marriage alliance. He would offer the hand of one of his own daughters. For a smaller king, this looked like the deal of a lifetime. Marrying the daughter of the great Khan, it meant protection. It meant status. It meant you were now family with the most powerful man on earth. But there was a catch, a deadly condition hidden in the fine print of the marriage contract. Before the marriage could take place, the king was required to dismiss all his other wives. He had to divorce them, cast them out, or send them away. He had to make Genghis Khan's daughter his only queen. This wasn't just jealousy. It was a political coup. It ensured that there were no rival heirs, no other influences whispering in the king's ear. The Mongol daughter had to be the sole voice of authority in the royal tent. Once the wedding was over and the champagne, or fermented mare's milk, had dried, the second phase of the trap began. Genghis Khan would immediately draft his new son-in-law into the Mongol army, but he didn't give him a desk job. He didn't put him in the rear guard. He honored him by assigning him to the front lines of the Mongol wars. He would send these kings to lead the charges against the walls of China or the armies of Persia. He would place them in the most dangerous, suicidal positions on the battlefield. The result was almost mathematically guaranteed. The son-in-law would die in battle. It was a ruthless, cynical cycle. Genghis Khan was essentially feeding these kings into a meat grinder. And while they were dying for the glory of the Mongol Empire, who was left back home running their kingdom? With the husband dead, the rule of that kingdom didn't pass to his brothers or his old advisors. By Mongol law, it passed his queen, Genghis Khan's daughter. Suddenly, Genghis Khan didn't just have an ally. He had a puppet state ruled by his own flesh and blood. His daughters, now grieving widows, would take the throne. These women were not raised to be passive observers. They were raised by the wolf himself. They were fierce, intelligent, and fiercely loyal to their father. They acted as a protective shield around the Mongol homeland. While Genghis expanded the borders outward, his daughters sat on the thrones of the interior, guarding the supply lines and crushing any rebellions. And what of the original wives? The women who were cast aside to make room for the Mongol daughters? Their fate was tragic. They were the collateral damage of this political game. When the king dismissed them, they lost everything, their homes, their status, and often their children. They were usually distributed to the troops or sent into servitude, just like the wives of the conquered enemies. It was a total replacement of the female elite. Genghis Khan systematically replaced the rulers of enemy nations with his own daughters, while the original wives of those kings were erased from history. This strategy turned the wives of the world into pawns. It showed that for Genghis Khan, marriage wasn't about love, and it wasn't even really about family. It was about acquisition. He used his daughters to annex kingdoms without needing to leave a garrison of soldiers behind. In the end, the secret to the Mongol Empire's stability wasn't just the men on horseback. It was a ring of widow queens guarding the heart of the empire, ruling over the graves of the husbands their father had sent to die. The most terrifying part of this story isn't what happened in the 13th century. It isn't the burning cities, the pyramids of skulls, or the rivers running red with blood. The most terrifying part is what remains today. Genghis Khan died in 1227, but in a very real biological sense, he never actually left. We often think of conquest as holding land, painting a map a different color. But Genghis Khan's practice of taking enemy wives was so extensive, and his harem grew so large, historical estimates suggest he had over 500 wives and concubines, that he left a genetic mark on humanity that is unrivaled in the history of our species. He turned the act of reproduction into an industrial process. By hoarding the most fertile and high-ranking women of every nation he conquered, he ensured that his DNA had a monopoly on the future. For centuries, this was just a legend. People joked about everyone in Asia being related to the Khan. But in 2003, a group of geneticists conducted a massive study on the DNA of men across the former Mongol Empire, and what they found shocked the scientific world. They discovered a unique Y-chromosomal lineage, a specific genetic signature that was present in an astronomical number of men, in the vast region stretching from the Pacific Ocean to the Caspian Sea. This marker appears in about 8% of the male population. When you extrapolate that to the entire world, it accounts for roughly 0.5% of the total male population. That might sound like a small number, but do the math. That equates to roughly 16 million men alive today who are direct patrilineal descendants of Genghis Khan. To put that in perspective, that is a population larger than nations like Belgium, Cuba, or Greece, all descended from one single man. Think about what that statistic actually represents. Every single one of those 16 million people is a living testament to the strategy we've talked about today. It is a result of the systematic culling of other men and the systematic collection of women, the terror he inflicted on enemy wives, the forced marriages, the absorption of their bloodlines, was so successful that his DNA conquered the world in a way his armies never could. The walls of his empire eventually fell. The Mongol Golden Horde eventually dissolved, but the DNA remains. This brings us to the darkest realization of all. History is usually written by the victors, but genetics is the victory. The husbands of those enemy wives, the kings of the Khwarezmians, the chieftains of the Merkits, they were wiped from history. They were killed before they could reproduce, or their children were killed after them. Their lineages were cut short. They are genetic dead ends. But the Khan's lineage thrived. He effectively replaced the genetic history of Asia with his own. So, when we ask, what did Genghis Khan do enemy wives? The answer is simple and terrifying. He didn't just defeat them. He used them as vessels to make himself immortal. He hijacked the biological future of the nations he conquered. The story of Genghis Khan is often painted as one of glorious battles, military tactics, and men on horseback conquering the world. We look at the statues and the maps, and we marvel at the scale of it all. But the true machinery of his empire was built on the silent suffering and forced assimilation of thousands of women. It was built on the daughter diplomacy that sacrificed his own flesh and blood, and the brutal wife distribution that erased the identities of queens. It is a stark, uncomfortable reminder that in the ancient world, biology was warfare. The battlefield wasn't just the dirt and the grass. It was a family tree. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the darker, psychological side of history, please make sure to hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell, so you don't miss our next story on the hidden horrors of the ancient world. Thanks for watching.